Okay, so you want to own a medieval toll bridge. You've done the math. Thousands of crossings a year, a coin a head, forever. Every cart, every horse, every sheep walking to market has to cross your river, and there's no other way across for miles. The math is right, but the bridge you think you're buying, solid stone, guaranteed income, yours for generations, is not what you actually end up owning. By the end of this video, you'll know three things. First, where the money on a medieval bridge actually comes from. And it's not mostly the toll. Second, why bridges that had a legal monopoly on an entire river crossing still went broke over and over for 600 years. Third, why owning a bridge was never really the business. A bridge was just the excuse for something else. Something almost nobody who bought into one understood they were buying. And somewhere in the middle of this video, there's a version of this deal where getting the toll rate wrong doesn't just cost you money. It costs you your castle and possibly your neck. 3 ways into this business, and at every tier, the price tag tells you almost nothing. The real question is what you actually end up owning. At the bottom, a village or a minor lord petitions the crown for a grant of pontage, a royal license to collect a toll just long enough to build or repair one bridge. The first one ever issued in 1228 went to a crossing at Ferrybridge in Yorkshire. The entry cost is almost nothing. A petition, a few fees, the king's seal. What you're actually buying isn't a bridge, it's a clock, a handful of years before you're back at court, asking for an extension. The middle tier is a town corporation, negotiating a full charter, tolls for the bridge, bundled with the rights to wall the town and pave its streets, because one trip to the king beats 3. Gloucester did exactly this in 1331. This is a real business now. A stone bridge, a maintenance budget, a paid collector. What you're actually buying is a working asset, but not full control of it because the crown can always decide your charter isn't worth renewing. At the top, you get something like Old London Bridge, a construction project that took 33 years under a priest named Peter of Colechurch, who died before it was finished. What you're actually buying at this scale was never transportation infrastructure. By the time it opens in 1209, it's already the most valuable real estate in England, centuries before anyone thinks to call it that. None of those 3 purchases include the part that actually breaks people. Your grant is temporary. Pontage licenses ran for a fixed term, and if the work wasn't done in time, you went back and asked the king for more years, more fees, no guarantee. And the crown's own foundational law doesn't help you either. Magna Carta itself says no village or person owes bridge duty except those of old, legally bound to it, which sounds protective until you realize it just means the crown ends up responsible for almost everyone else's bridge, and the crown does not enjoy that bill. Which is why, again and again, the same inquisitions return to the same verdict. No one is responsible for the repair of this bridge. That sentence isn't a loophole. It's a warning about who the cost eventually lands on. Where does the money actually come from? Not the toll booth. That's the part everyone gets wrong before they buy in. Picture a subscription you can't cancel because there's no competing service. That's the toll at its purest. On the bridge at Avignon, a horse and rider paid 2 deniers, a wagon paid 4, a donkey or a sheep paid half a denier. Small coins. A rider pays roughly what you'd pay for a loaf of bread. On its own, that's a rounding error. The escalation is volume. A bridge on a major trade route isn't crossed by one rider, it's crossed by thousands of carts and animals a year, every year, for as long as the crossing exists, and unlike almost any other medieval enterprise, demand doesn't depend on the quality of what you're selling. Nobody buys a bridge crossing because they love the craftsmanship. They buy it because the river is there and you own the only legal way over it. But watch what happens on the biggest and best documented bridge in medieval Europe. On Old London Bridge, the body that ran the operation was called Bridge House, and the surviving city records are specific about where its money came from. Rents and quit rents on property. A quit rent being a fixed annual payment that freed or quit a tenant from further feudal labor obligations. The rents from the stocks market and passage tolls, in that order, by size. At its peak, the bridge itself carried nearly 500 shops in five-story buildings with a resident population, pushing 500 people, all paying rent to Bridge House for the privilege of doing business on the one strip of land every single traveler between London and the south of England was legally required to cross on foot. The toll was pocket change next to the rent roll. Pause on that, because it inverts the whole premise you started with. This was never really a transportation business. A bridge is a plot of land shaped like a monopoly. Once you legally own the only crossing, you don't just charge people to walk over it, you charge them to open a shop on it because you've just created the highest foot traffic real estate in the entire region, and nobody can build a competing storefront across the river to undercut your rent. Now split the income properly because it runs in at least 3 separate streams. Passage tolls, the smallest slice, but the most reliable, since it's collected per head regardless of who's crossing. Property rents, shops, houses, even a residence for the Lord Mayor himself in a building called non-such house, the largest and most stable slice, because leases run for years and don't depend on daily traffic counts. And a third stream that looks like it shouldn't exist on a bridge at all: religious income. The chapel at the center of Old London Bridge, dedicated to Thomas Becket, sat directly on the pilgrim route to Becket's shrine at Canterbury, and pilgrims crossing to pray gave alms on the way through. A toll that people paid voluntarily, on top of the mandatory one, because you'd also built a spiritual reason to cross. One sentence covers the model so far. Revenue equals toll rate multiplied by forced traffic volume multiplied by however many separate things you can legally attach to that traffic: rent, worship, storage, market rights. But that raises the actual question this video is built around. If the toll was never the valuable part, why did the real estate turn out to be worth so much more than it? And why is real estate not the toll, the thing that ends up deciding which of these bridges is still standing 600 years later? You've probably stood on a bridge like this without realizing what you were looking at. Have you ever walked through an airport terminal and noticed that the gate you actually need is at the far end, past every shop in the building? Medieval bridge builders solved the same problem 400 years earlier on purpose. 4 design choices, and every one of them answers the same question. How do you turn foot traffic you're legally guaranteed to keep into property you get to keep charging for? First, jettied construction. Houses on London Bridge were built to overhang the roadway on upper floors. The ground floor might be a narrow 10-foot shopfront, but the building above it bulges out over the street, doubling or tripling the usable floor space on a strip of land that's otherwise fixed at 19 arches wide. You can't widen a bridge. You can absolutely build upward and outward on top of it. Second, the drawbridge and the portcullis at the southern end, technically a defensive structure to stop invaders from the Southwark side. And functionally a choke point that lets the operator control exactly who crosses and when, with zero possibility of anyone slipping past unmetered. Third, the chapel. This is the one that surprises people. St. Thomas's Chapel wasn't decoration. It was, for the bridge's first 60 years, the entity that actually managed the tolls and rents before the monks agreed to hand control over to the city's own committee, Bridge House. The chapel is what economists would call vertical integration. The same institution supplying the spiritual justification for the crossing was also collecting the rent. Fourth, the anchor tenant. When the old drawbridge tower was rebuilt in the 1570s as non-such house, it became the single most prestigious address on the bridge: 4 stories, onion domes, a classical facade, and the kind of tenant that building could attract set the tone and the rent ceiling for every shop around it. That's the same predictable, compounding income at work, a flat annual rent instead of a toll that rises and falls with daily traffic, which is exactly what made Bridge House's property roll more valuable than its toll booth. If there's a VIP segment in this business, it's whoever holds the best positioned shop on the bridge, usually a goldsmith or a bookseller, someone selling something small, expensive, and worth carrying past a captive audience twice a day. Their rent alone, across 5 centuries of surviving lease records, tells you more about the real value of a medieval bridge than any toll ledger does. None of this was ever really about crossing a river. Every jettied floor, every rebuilt gatehouse, every lease on that chapel is the same conversion, repeated. Turn traffic nobody's legally allowed to avoid into property, nobody can compete with. If the crossing is guaranteed, and the customers have no choice, why did bridge owners keep going broke? The answer is everything else. Start with labor and maintenance because it never stops. At Old London Bridge, running the chapel alone, wages for chaplains and clerks cost roughly £40 a year in the 14 and 1500s, rising to £60 a century later, and that's before a single stone gets repointed. Then the exotic ones nobody warns you about at the entry price. Ice. In the winter of 1381, the River Medway at Rochester froze solid, and when it thawed in February, the pressure of the breaking ice and floodwater collapsed part of the old Roman-era bridge outright. Not slowly, not from neglect, but in a single season, from weather. Siege damage is on the list too. In 1226, the French king's forces damaged the bridge at Avignon during a military campaign, and King Louis VIII ordered parts of it torn down deliberately for strategic reasons that had nothing to do with tolls or trade. Remember that verdict from the repair records, the one that kept coming back again and again, no one is responsible for the repair of this bridge. And remember the other detail, the paperwork behind your side of the deal was never permanent to begin with. If you're operating with a proper royal grant and it lapses, you lose the legal right to collect, full stop. Your income doesn't decline, it ends. But if you skip the paperwork entirely and just start charging your own toll from your own castle, which is exactly what a wave of minor lords along the Rhine did once the Holy Roman Empire went without an emperor between 1250 and 1273. The number of unauthorized toll stations on that one river doubled to 20 in 4 years. The penalty for that wasn't a fine. In 1282, King Rudolf I personally destroyed 2 of these castles, Reichenstein and Suneck, and executed the lords who'd built them. The liability on an unauthorized toll operation was never just financial. It was personal, and in the worst cases, it was capital. Put plainly, that's the trade. Your revenue is guaranteed by law. Nothing else about this business is guaranteed by anything. 2 mistakes kill this business, over and over across 4 centuries in 2 completely different countries. The first is the slow one. Build in a place nature will eventually take back, and repair forever instead of walking away in time. The Pont Saint-Benazet at Avignon is the textbook case. Built between 1177 and 1185, 22 stone arches, 900 meters across the Rhone. At the time, one of the longest bridges in Europe, and for over a century the only stone crossing between Lyon and the Mediterranean, which meant a toll monopoly on some of the busiest north-south trade in France. The Rhone flooded constantly, and constantly took arches with it. The city rebuilt, and rebuilt, and rebuilt again for nearly 500 years. The final flood came in 1668. It tore out the central arches, and this time the city did the math on repair costs versus revenue and simply stopped. What's left today is 4 arches out of 22. Roughly 18 cents on the dollar of the original structure, kept not as a working toll crossing, but as a tourist ticket booth. The rule, a bridge built against a river that floods every year isn't a maintenance project, it's a debt that gets refinanced every time the water rises. And the rate only ever goes up. The second mistake is fast, and it's a pricing mistake, not a weather one. Charge more than your legal authority allows, and the people paying you eventually organize and take the asset back by force. That's the entire story of the Rhine's so-called robber barons, minor lords who started charging their own illegal tolls from their own castles the moment nobody with real power was watching. It would be like a landlord illegally doubling the rent on every tenant in a building where all the tenants happen to be armed and coordinated. The outcome isn't a lawsuit, it's the tenants burning the building down. A coalition of merchant cities organized against them, sieging and dismantling the worst offenders' castles one by one. You already heard how that ended for the lords who lost Reichenstein and Suneck. The rule, pricing power without legitimate authority behind it, isn't leverage, it's a countdown. because every customer you overcharge is also a potential member of the army that eventually shows up at your gate. Most owners in this business don't survive it. The rare ones who do all made the exact same pivot. And it's the answer to the real estate. Question from a few minutes ago. They stopped being toll collectors and became landlords. The clearest surviving example is the Rochester Bridge Trust, founded in 1399 in Kent, England, by two men, Sir John de Cobham and Sir Robert Knowles. After the old Roman-era bridge over the Medway collapsed in that same 1381 ice flood mentioned earlier. Instead of setting up another temporary royal toll license, they did something almost nobody else in this business did. They got King Richard II to charter a permanent trust, and then they endowed it, not with a toll right, but with land. Tenements in London near Leadenhall Market, farms and manors across Kent and Essex, thousands of acres, structured to generate rental income forever, independent of any single king's willingness to renew a license. Today, over 6 centuries later, that trust still exists, still maintains the crossing, still charges no toll at all, and its endowment, according to its own recent public accounts, is worth around £114 million. It's the only bridge trust in England still doing the exact job it was chartered to do in the Middle Ages. The pattern behind survivors like this, wherever you find them. They convert a temporary license into a permanent legal entity as early as possible. They stop depending on toll revenue and shift the core income to real estate rents, which don't expire when a king changes his mind. They build supporting income around the choke point, shops, market rights, chapel offerings, rather than relying on the toll alone. They register as something the Crown and the Church both have reasons to protect, which insulates them from the seizures and revocations that killed everyone else. And every one of these steps happens in the first few years, before the founders are gone and there's no one left with the standing to negotiate the charter that saves the whole thing. That's the kind of pivot this channel exists to dig up out of 600-year-old account books, which is what the subscribe button is quietly sitting there for. One line, and it's the whole difference. A toll grant is a job. An endowed trust is a business. All right, step back for a second. The paradox from the start of this video resolves right here. A guaranteed legal monopoly on the only crossing for miles, and yet bridge after bridge across 600 years and 2 different countries went broke or got torn apart. Both things are true, and they were never in conflict because the guarantee only ever covered one side of the ledger. Compare this to something ordinary, a medieval baker. A baker's income isn't guaranteed at all. If the bread is bad, customers simply go elsewhere. But a baker's costs are almost entirely under the baker's own control. Flour, fuel, labor, all things you can plan for. A bridge is the exact inverse. Your revenue is protected by royal law, immune to competition by design. Your costs are dictated by a flooding river, a freezing winter, a king who needs your bridge for a siege, a chapel staff that has to be paid whether or not it rains. You can't outcompete a flood. You can't negotiate with ice. That's the actual trade at the center of this entire industry. Guaranteed revenue against completely unguaranteed everything else. The toll booth was never the risky part of this business. The roof over your head, the arch under your feet, and the century you happened to be born into, that was always the risky part. And once you understand that trade, one more question answers itself. Which side of it did the people who actually got rich figure out first? So, how much would you actually make if you did this right? Scenario 1, the modest one. You're the small grantee, ferry bridge scale, a village petition, a wooden or single arch stone crossing, a pontage license running maybe 5 to 7 years at a stretch. Your investment is small, a petition, legal fees, materials, and your own labor overseeing the build. Your income is a mix of small tolls and whatever rent a single shop or two brings in, enough to cover repairs and pay yourself something. Payback happens within the license term itself because the cost of entry was never large to begin with. It's not going to make you a fortune, but it's the version of this business that quietly renews, license after license, for generations, without ever making anyone in the family famous. Scrappy, boring, and durable. Scenario 2, the top one. And this is where the last twist in the whole video lives. You're not a toll collector at all. You're a founder, the way Cobham and Nolas were in 1399. You don't petition for a toll license. You petition the crown for a permanent charter. And instead of investing in the bridge itself, you invest in land, manors, farms, city tenements, and legally attach the rental income from that land to the maintenance of the crossing forever. There's no toll revenue line at all because the crossing stays free. And this is the part nobody selling you the deal ever mentions. The business you actually built was never a bridge business. It was a permanent, tax-advantaged, royally protected landholding company that happens to have a bridge attached to its name. And 6 centuries later, it's still standing. Still solvent, worth around £114 million because nobody involved was ever really collecting coins from travelers. They were collecting rent from time itself. So, okay, you wanted to own a medieval toll bridge. The version of that sentence that actually makes you rich sounds a little different. You don't want to own the bridge. You want to own the land underneath it forever and let the bridge be somebody else's problem.